Europe is actually taking the brunt of the damage from these sanctions. And then you had the Nord Stream attack as well, that terrorist attack, which I mean, we can talk about who did it, who benefits. But yeah, I just wanted your impressions about this kind of very counterproductive move by Europe on behalf of the U.S. to attack Russia in this way economically and create what seems like a permanent war situation, that a war that doesn't seem to have an end, but which doesn't have really like these benefits that you would expect from Europe. And then I want to get to comments from the foreign policy chief over at the EU after that. So comments on that before we get to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you summed it up extremely well. Now, it's difficult to understand what the thinking of European politicians, and by the way, British politicians, was. But my sense, and I think this is what Alex was touching on, is that when the war in Ukraine began, they thought this crisis would be over very quickly. They thought that once they imposed all these sanctions on Russia, then they are enormously wide-ranging sanctions, the seizure of the central bank's assets, the sanctioning of the central bank itself, the disconnection of Russian banks from SWIFT, the attacks on Russian oil, the attacks on Russian gas, all of that would provoke an economic crisis in Russia, that crisis would lead to the fall of the Russian government, that when the government fell, when Putin himself fell, it was taken as axiomatic that whatever replaced Putin would somehow have been better disposed to the West in some way, and somehow everything would then be sorted out. You'd have the access to the gas, you'd have the access to the oil, you'd have all those things. Everything would go back to normal, but of course, the terrible man in the Kremlin would have gone. And in fact, it wouldn't go back to normal. We'd have broken Russia. The problem, the challenge, the difficulty Russia faces would have ended. And somehow that would have been better for all of us. And of course, it hasn't worked out like that, because Russia has turned out to be economically far more resilient than the West, certainly the Europeans, imagined. And not just the Europeans, the US as well. We've had admissions from US officials that has been the case. And instead of knocking Russia out, knocking Putin out quickly in a few weeks, what they found themselves instead is in a long drawn out war of economic attrition, in which Europe is a victim. But all of these political leaders, Scholz, Macron, the Johnson Truss government in Britain, they don't have a way out because their political reputations are now so invested in this. So we've got this extraordinary situation where we're trapped in an economic war that nobody really imagined or expected. And the political survival of the governments in Europe and of the European Commission as well, by the way, is now tied to the continuation of this economic war to its bitterest end. So we're going down, and there is no sign that the captain has any interest in changing course. And of course, that's creating major problems, just as you said, in France, in Germany. In Britain, we have an economic crisis. It's now becoming a political crisis as well. But the extraordinary thing about the political crisis in Britain is that nobody talks about the way in which it relates to the sanctions, the economic war. Nobody offers any solutions. Nobody is looking for any kind of change, because to do so would be to sort of break the omerta. It would break the discipline of the political class, and it might jeopardize the whole of the political class if that was admitted.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback off of what Alexander is saying there. He's exactly right. In the beginning of this thing, you saw the collective West, the European Union. They went in with a shock and awe strategy to break Russia, and even if you take away the seizing of the foreign reserves and canceling SWIFT and all of these incredible steps that they took to try and break Russia, they had it in for the Russian people and for the Russian society. And you know that because the first thing that the European Union did when they decided to place sanctions on Russia is they went after the media and they shut down the airspace. They told the Russians, you're not welcome in Europe. No planes can fly into Europe anymore. For all of the EU members, I remember the EU took a decision on behalf of all the members. They said, you can't come into EU territory, not German territory, not French territory, not Greek territory, EU territory. So that was, to me, that was an indication that this is much more than about Ukraine. This was about breaking Russia, breaking the Russian Federation, regime change in the Kremlin, and just breaking the Russian spirit. And they completely misjudged how things were going to turn out, because here we are 7 months later, and there is an economic war, and it is an economic war of attrition. But when you look at what Putin and Lavrov and all of the high-level Kremlin officials are doing, is they're just pivoting and they're shifting their focus to Asia, to China, to the Middle East, to Africa, South America, and they're going about business as usual. They're having CIS forums. They're traveling to Astana. They're meeting with Xi Jinping. They're going to SCO summits, and they're striking business deals. They're building pipelines. Turkey's going to become a gas hub. It's going to be the gas hub for all of Europe, and they're just moving on. Meanwhile, in the collective West, what you have is this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week obsession with trying to break Russia's back. And they're obsessed with it. And they just can't sit there and say, look, Zelensky, just say you're going to be neutral. Is it that hard for Ukraine to say we're going to be neutral? I mean, was that really the issue in all of this? That Ukraine couldn't just put it on paper in their constitution and say we're going to be neutral, like so many other countries? Nope, they couldn't do it. And here we are 7-8 months later, and Russia, in my opinion, they're just about to begin now. I think now they're about to begin. I could be wrong on that, but that's my hunch. They're about to start now. What we've seen for 7 months was just, as they said, a special military operation.